Hi, my name is Robbie Stewart, a Bachelor of Paleontology who graduated from Carleton University, and today we're going to be talking about freshwater crocodiles. While the land masses and oceans of the early age of mammals were inhabited by ancient relatives of modern crocodiles that had survived past the Cretaceous extinction, the waterways that we associate modern crocodiles with today actually didn't have any prehistoric relic populations, any cousins or competitors that survived through to the age of mammals before dying off before the present day. Instead, the waterways were filled with the ancestors of modern crocodilians. By the Late Cretaceous, the three modern clades of crocodilians had all evolved. The alligators, with their blunted jaws, the gavials, with their long and narrow snouts and needle teeth, and crocodiles, with their pointed triangular snouts and their powerful crushing bites. Even during their earliest emergences, many of the earliest crocodilians we know, like Brachychampsa, Leteusuchus, and Albertasuchus, were already well adapted for living in fresh water. And the three major crocodilian families had even begun to specialize by the time of the Late Cretaceous. Besides the giant dinosaur-eating Deinosuchus that we met last time, there were also clam-crushing specialists like Stangerochampsa that had evolved. Even the oldest known gavialoids had already left fresh water for marine environments like Thoracasuchus and Portugalasuchus, swimming through the oceans of Cretaceous Europe instead of in the freshwater river systems. Because of this, scientists think that there's another ghost lineage, similar to the one that existed in the Cenozoic when we were covering Mesozoic crocodiles. Somewhere back in the Cretaceous, in the fogs of time, we had a common ancestor of all three of the major species of crocodilians, one that was adapted for freshwater, but not specialized the way that the three families had already begun to specialize. We believe that their earliest ancestor was a gavialoid, one of those crocodiles with the armor on the sides of their bodies as well as the backs. And we think that they split from the gavialoid during the early Cretaceous. We believe that they split during the early Cretaceous because there was a temperature maximum during the early Cretaceous, during which all kinds of reptile species experienced a spike in diversity. So, we think the crocodiles were much the same. By the time of the Late Cretaceous, the gavialoids were either extinct or very nearly extinct, and they had been replaced in the river systems all over the world by true crocodilians. Not only did the true crocodilians avoid the extinction of their relatives the gavialoids, but they also shrugged off the asteroid remarkably well. As we've mentioned before, many species of crocodilian are known to have survived the boundary between the Late Cretaceous and the start of the Cenozoic. And we think about half of all crocodilian species that were alive during the Mesozoic survived the extinction event. This is remarkable because most animal species saw major losses in their clades as they moved from the extinction event into the Cenozoic. Even creatures that we associate with having a good survivorship, like mammals, birds, or turtles, saw many different species go extinct. And mammals and birds in particular saw entire families disappear overnight. Not the crocodiles. Crocodilians managed to make it through with every major family intact. All three of the ones that we're familiar with today were still alive during the Late Cretaceous and managed to carry on through to the Cenozoic, more or less like nothing had happened. So it was that even as life was recovering after the extinction event, they still had to worry about crocodiles at their water holes. Borealisuchus was just as likely to go after a hippo-like tusked mammal called Coryphodon, or the giant person-sized flightless bird Gastornis, as it was to go after a Leptoceratops or Struthiomimus 10 million years and an entire world earlier. The strange, tiny crustacean-crunching alligators that we saw at the Museum of Nature when we were looking at their fossils also survived into the age of mammals. And in fact, the genus that we were looking at comes from the very start of the age of mammals. These alligatoroids had small bodies, blunt, short snouts, and mouths filled with two different types of teeth. There were needle-like ones at the front, which were good at catching small animals, and then there were rounded ones in the back, which were built for crushing the shells of the insects and invertebrates they would have been eating. Perhaps the weirdest of these crustacean-cracking alligator relatives was a species called Ceratopsuchus, which had these weird horns growing up from the top of its head. Because the horns weren't pointed forwards or to the sides, and because they were blunted, we think they were for display rather than for combat. They would need to use their horns to differentiate themselves from their relatives because these clam-crushing alligators lived all over the northern hemisphere, with examples coming from North Dakota, Wyoming, and New Mexico, as well as France, Germany, and Belgium. These creatures lasted up to the very end of the Eocene, or maybe the very beginning of the Oligocene, about 37 million years ago. Just like their relatives, the Planiocranids and the Cenozoians, who had been causing so much of a stir on land, the northern distribution of these crustacean-crunching crocodilians spelled the end for them when the cooling event of the Eocene made it so cold that they could no longer survive in their environments. At the same time that tiny alligatoroids like Azcatanca were crunching through the crustaceans in the mud and on the riverbanks of these ancient water systems, the caimans were ruling them. Caiman species like Chrysochampsa grew up to 4 meters long and would have been ambush predators lurking in the river systems. The mammal predators of the time were tiny creatures, only about the size of a weasel or a fox. Because of this, caimans were the apex predators of this ecosystem in North America. These tiny mammals were the ancestors of what would become bears, wolves, big cats, all of the apex predators we know today. But in this time period, they were only prey for the giant caimans that were the apex predators of this area. Unlike their small crustacean hunting cousins, the caimans who went extinct all across North America and Europe weren't the only caimans left. Of course, we still have caimans today. And just like the terror birds and the Cenozoians, they found refuge in South America. When the Miocene began to warm things up again, the caimans joined their distant relatives, the Cenozoians, in spreading and diversifying all across the continent of South America. Perhaps the weirdest of these caimans was a creature called Mesozoic, which had a flat head about the size of a human chest. This flat head was rimmed with almost 100 teeth, which were shaped and sized like a pin, all of them interlocked, almost perfectly overlapping. Because of this, scientists believe that this crocodilian was a filter feeder, one of only 2 examples of filter feeding crocodiles to ever evolve. But an alternative theory suggests that it might have stuck its giant, flat skull into the mud and filtered out animals from the silt and debris instead of from the water. Because most of the remains we have from Mesozoic are only its gigantic head, it's actually very difficult to tell how big this crocodilian was exactly. The smallest species might have been as small as 2.5 meters or as big as 6 meters long, whereas the biggest species might have been up to 10 meters long or only half that size. There's still debates either way. The debate centers around whether these were giant caimans with ordinary-sized heads or ordinary-sized caimans with giant heads. But the most common interpretation of Mesozoic is that it would have lived something like a freshwater whale, gulping down huge volumes of water and then straining them for crustaceans and tiny invertebrate larvae living in the water. It was far from the only caiman in these water systems, though. Like an echo of their alligatoroid cousins that had gone extinct in the north, there was a wiener dog-sized caiman called Cenozoic living in these waters, which also specialized in crushing shelled animals. This time, its teeth were flat and specialized in crunching through clam shells, which are harder than crustacean shells. There were also 2 species of modern caiman that were already living in these water systems 15 million years ago, although the remains of them are fragmentary, and we aren't sure if they're the exact species or just very, very close relatives. Then, around the same time that the caimans were beginning to diversify, the gavialoids, that needle-nosed family of crocodilians that we talked about in the first Cenozoic crocodile video, arrived in these same river systems from Peru. Like we talked about in that video, the gavialoids swam their way across the Atlantic Ocean, going from the oceans of Europe to the coasts of Africa, and then finally to the Caribbean, before ending up in Peru and swimming down the river systems, infiltrating the heart of South America and all of its freshwater systems as well. Here in these river systems, they found lush jungles that were filled with all sorts of life. stingrays, cane toads, green anacondas, the strange nut-cracking fish called pacus, piranhas, all kinds of animals that we have today in the Amazon river systems were just as prevalent and just as tasty to the fish-eating gavials that found them 15 million years ago. These gavials wasted no time in growing as big as their ocean-going counterparts. Piscogavialis, one of the ocean-going gavialoids that we talked about in the first video, grew to 8 meters long, and Hesperogavialis, one of these river-dwelling gavialoids, grew to about the same size at 8 meters long as well. But in these river systems that were so plentiful and full of fish and small reptiles for them to eat, the gavialoids grew even bigger. The biggest of them grew to 10 meters long, becoming a candidate for the single largest gavialoid to ever evolve. Gryposuchus wasn't just big, it was also successful, spreading from the northern parts of Peru all the way down to the southern tip of Venezuela. But the appearance of these giants had a consequence. All of these crocodilians we've mentioned so far were very specialized in small animals. Gryposuchus and Hesperogavialis would have been fish catchers, or hunters of small reptiles and mammals in these systems. And Morosuchus was a filter feeder, eating small invertebrates in the water column or the mud of the river systems. This meant that there were all these gigantic crocodilians surviving in these systems, but no apex predator. So from within the caiman family itself, a new apex predator evolved to eat these other crocodilians. In order to prey on these crocodilian species, their predator grew even bigger. Purusaurus was the king of all crocodilians, a caiman that grew to be up to 13 meters long and weighed as much as 13 tons to match. Even some of the Mesozoic dinosaur-eating giants like Sarcosuchus couldn't compare to Purusaurus, with the only rival to its crown as king of the crocodilians being Deinosuchus, the dinosaur-eating crocodile from the Late Cretaceous that would have been feeding on ceratopsians and even tyrannosaurs. This giant is known only from a skull the size of a black bear, big enough for a human being to comfortably sit inside. But because it's only known from its skull, there's still debates about how big it could actually get, just like with Morosuchus. Recent estimates have put it at only 9 meters long, although there's older ones that go as big as 13. But there was also an even smaller species, which we know for sure would have been about 75% of the size of the bigger species, whatever its maximum size ended up being. Unlike Gryposuchus or Morosuchus, the caiman evolved to eat other caimans had a skull specifically adapted for tearing out chunks of flesh. Just like a T-Rex, it had thick, reinforced jaws shaped like an ice cream scoop, designed for scooping flesh out of the other gigantic crocodiles of the river systems that it shared. But other crocodilians weren't the only things that Purusaurus were eating. There was a type of turtle the size of a car called Stupendemes living in these river systems, as well as fish called arapaima that grow as big as alligators, which are still alive today. They also would have lived alongside hippo-sized hoof mammals called astrapotheres that might have weighed as much as 4 tons. All of these giants living and depending on these river systems suited Purusaurus just fine. Scientists estimate it needed an average of 40 kilograms of food per day just to survive. Even its land-bound apex predator counterparts weren't safe from it. Do you remember the Colombian terror bird that was just discovered this year? We talked about it living alongside Langstonia, one of the Notosuchians. But one of the most notable things about this knob of bone that was found from this giant terror bird is that it had teeth from a Purusaurus embedded inside of the femur knob. These bite marks were partially healed, suggesting that the terror bird survived the initial attack by the Purusaurus, but didn't survive much longer afterwards. Which means it would have been alive at the time that the Purusaurus was attacking it, rather than just scavenging. Terror birds would get the last laugh, though. Purusaurus depended on these lush river systems filled with life. Browsers like the astrapotheres, fish catchers like the giant turtles and the giant gavialoids that it lived in the environment with, and the filter-feeding Morosuchus. It needed so much food per day that if anything were to happen to this environment, it would vanish along with it. And sure enough, just like the gavialoids living on the coasts, The gavialoids living in the river systems all went extinct when the Andes began to rise and shuffled all of the river systems around. Instead of the rivers feeding into the warmer tropical waters to the north, now they fed into the cool oceans closer to Antarctica, and so the interior of the entire continent began to cool down and dry out. With this cooling and drying came the disappearance of these mega river systems that were filled with the fish that Gryposuchus and Stupendemes would have needed in order to survive. And so, without these giant crocodilians to sustain it, Purosaurus went extinct along with them. With the collapse of the rainforests came the end of the golden age of crocodiles in South America. Not just the caimans, but also the Notosuchians, who went extinct at the same time, like we talked about in our earlier Cenozoic crocodile video, as well as the gavialoids. It was almost an apocalypse for these crocodilians. One could argue worse for them than the asteroid extinction had been at the end of the Cretaceous. Instead, the last predators standing in South America were the terror birds, who were able to better adapt to the drier and cooler conditions. Just like how the terror birds left behind smaller relatives that are still with us today, the caimans of South America's giant crocodile guilds also left behind smaller relatives that we still have today. And even now, there's still some of the apex predators in the river systems. The black caiman of South America grows to an impressive 6 meters long, and during the Pleistocene period it could have grown even bigger. But this didn't mean that they were the top predators of the river systems. While terror birds like Titanus were creating havoc in North America, North American predators also crossed over into South America. The infamous Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, was only about the size of a cougar when it first showed up in South America, but quickly grew into gigantic creatures. Smilodon populator, the largest of these, was a saber-toothed cat the size of a grizzly bear. An isotopic analysis of the bones of these animals show that 5% of their diet was caimans, including black caimans, who are some of the only caimans native to the regions where Smilodon populator was living. Even in the modern Amazon, jaguars sometimes prey on black caimans and all the other different types of caimans that live alongside them. So even though they're apex predators within their environment, they're not the only apex predators living in their environments anymore. Despite this, caimans remain a success story, being the most diverse group of crocodilians that are still alive today. The caimans also live on in a wide variety of niches, just like they had during their glory days in the Miocene. The broad-snouted caiman is actually an omnivorous crocodile, feeding on grasses and fruit that grow alongside the riverbank as much as it does the mammals and birds that live in those grasses. So I'm currently holding a Cuvier's dwarf caiman, which is a smaller species of alligatoroid. These creatures are similar to the American alligator, but they diverged during the Cenozoic period in its early development. The largest of caimans, Purosaurus, would have been about the size of a bus, but these caimans are among the smallest species. This is not quite adult size, this is a subadult, but they are getting towards adult size. And the smooth-fronted caiman is one of the most terrestrial crocodilians alive today, clambering up onto the riverbanks to chase after small mammals at night, just like the dwarf crocodiles of Africa do as well. But while the caimans have been an enduring success story in the southern hemisphere, proper alligators are most associated with the northern hemisphere, the same habitat that once doomed their relatives during the Eocene extinction. The American alligator is one of the most famous and successful crocodilians to ever live, having existed since the Miocene, one species for 15 million years, more or less unchanged from the time of Purosaurus. In fact, alligators are so successful that you can find them even in shelters and sanctuaries here in Ottawa. They get imported in from the Everglades, where they become animals that are in need of rescue. Let's meet one of these modern-day alligators that have existed since the Miocene and see what they're actually like, face to face.
So even this level of her staying is incredible, because like I said, she was up at the door trying to come out. So they learn very, very quickly. And I'll even show you. I'll show her the food and she won't grab it. Hey, you want to open up so we can get a picture? What you got? So her staying in the water, this is exactly what I want. I want to be able to turn my back on her. Not that you ever should. But if I whistle, she will come out. You can come in too. Sure. Just stand over there with them. You're good. Hey, stay. Noah, can I have the tongs?
Just coming out again.
Stay. Now to show her the food. No reaction. Hey, no.
Good job.
I'm going to try and get her to open up a bit. We used to actually have an alligator that trained to open her mouth and stay there with her mouth open until it was time for food. Hey.
But for as successful as American alligators are, their counterparts, the Chinese alligators, are both far less well known and in a lot more trouble. The Chinese alligator used to be found from Taiwan to Japan, living in the river habitats that Asia used to be known for. But as rice paddies have been developed across all of these freshwater habitats, the crocodilians that used to live and hunt within them no longer can survive there. As a result, the Chinese alligator is critically endangered. Despite their natural habitat coming into so much conflict with humans over food sources, these alligators pose no real threat to human beings. At only 2 meters long and about 90 pounds, they're focused exclusively on eating small animals like fish and crustaceans in the river systems. There is some good news for the Chinese alligators, as they've experienced a mild population rebound, going from a very small pool of less than 100 animals during the 80s to over 300 alive today. This is thanks almost entirely to the tireless work of Chinese conservationists at alligator hatcheries and the zoos that protect them all across North America and Europe. But these rebounds are very tentative and fragile. 300 is not a lot of animals. Genetic diversity is low, so all it would take is a few natural disasters or one particularly bad plague to wipe out this vulnerable population. If it did disappear, it would be a sad end to the long decline that alligators have experienced across all of Asia and Europe since their glory days during the Eocene. But even as they experience this decline in Asia, they're continuing to find more success in the Americas. Despite everything, they're an enduring family, and hopefully these little alligators from China can bounce back from the brink of extinction.